Hey guys, Ryan here. Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, and after nearly 1.5 years to the Tone Engineer, today I'm going to try to cop some of the citrus-flavored tones of some of my favorite artists, including Sleep, Mastodon, and some that use the orange amplifiers in a less conventional method. A couple things to get out of the way before we get straight into the tone talk. So first of all, this is indeed the first video I've filmed in this new space. For those of you that don't know, which I imagine is most of you, I ended up moving again, and this isn't 100% set up yet, but it's pretty much there. And I'm much happier with the voiceover quality because the room is treated better and less boomy, and hopefully we'll be here for quite a while, as in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 years is my hope. So still working out a few kinks with the color grading and that sort of thing. The B-roll will look a little different than the A-roll, but give me some time and we'll straighten that out and hopefully have a cohesive and cool-looking video experience for everyone. As far as the Tone Engineer series goes itself, the reason I've not revisited this for so long is because I was having trouble coming up with video concepts that would be realistic for me to make in a timely manner and not cost an arm and a leg, because what I found was that a lot of the sounds I wanted to go after, there's either way too much for a single video and I didn't want to break it up into multiple parts because they would still be kind of too closely related, or there simply wasn't enough to go after for a single kind of sound. And what I ended up realizing is that it makes way more sense to go after multiple artists and multiple tones using a single or collection of gear. And what I mean by that is, instead of doing the Marshall gears of Metallica or the Mesa Boogie gears of Meshuggah, it makes more sense in this instance to go after several artist sounds that revolve around a single amplifier or a single preamp processor or whatever it might be. So instead of the past collections that I've done in the past, going forward, what you would, I guess, consider the A side of the Tone Engineer videos will be in this format. We're going to go after multiple albums, multiple artists, using, for now, one single amplifier head or whatever it might be in the future. Now, coming up in a month or 2 or 3, whatever it might be, we'll still continue the B side, where we go after more generic sounds. So like in the past, I've done a stereo cover rig or a country rockabilly rig or the plexi pedal platform. So next video, we will probably do our last deep dive on the Orange Dark Terror and make something like a, let's say, stoner-ish, doomish metal rig for under X amount of dollars, you know, that kind of stuff. Let's hop right into it then with the centerpiece of today's video, the Orange Dark Terror. If you'd like a deeper dive into this amplifier, I do have a stupidly long review that you can watch somewhere around here. Now, later, never, I don't care, I'm not a cop. But this amplifier is interesting for this video because neither Sleep nor Mastodon use this particular head. Some of the other ones do in a manner that it actually doesn't really matter that it's the Dark Terror. But this does cop a lot of the sounds. It is unmistakably orange, but it is contemporary in a way that it kind of works to act as a blend of all the amps or all the rigs that both artists have used over the years. And I think a few things factor into that. So first things first, the 15-watt output power. Though I don't particularly love the EL84 tubes in the power section of this amp, what this does allow is to be ran louder without completely blowing your eardrums like a 50-watt or 100-watt amplifier can in a bedroom space. So you'll notice for especially the sleep tones here, I'm running the master volume well past noon a lot of the time. So it's kind of a balancing act between how much preamp distortion I want versus a little bit of power amp distortion, and particularly how this amp saturates in the mids when you do push the master volume. The second thing is the shape control, which is an all-in-one tone control. I think this is a far more powerful tone stack than, say, like the regular Tiny Terror. I think that's just like a high cut or something, though maybe it's not as powerful as some of the bigger brothers in the Orange arsenal. And then finally, the gain control. You'll notice on some of these examples, I use the amp gain by itself. It has that lovely saturated orange thing that's just going to work for this kind of material. What you'll also notice is that it takes pedals extremely well, which is something that, though Plexi style amplifiers, Marshalls, clean channels, they do a fine enough job with that. I feel like this amplifier is one of the best I've ever ran into in terms of melding its own preamp distortion with, say, a hard clipping or soft clipping pedal. You can definitely still hear that the pedal is doing something. Whether we have like a rat style pedal or an OD250 pedal, if you run the gain high and the volume low, where you're not pushing the amp too hard, but you're still giving it a distorted signal, it does almost the Boss HM2 thing where you have gain on gain, distortion on distortion, and you can very much hear the contributions of both. So that's what I really like about this amp. For the guitar then, at least for sleep and Mastodon tones, I'm going to be using my Gibson SGJ. Nothing particularly exquisite about this guitar. This is, at least was, a lower end Gibson actually, but there's a few things that I like about this and that made this a easy pick for this video. First things first, Gibson scale length, 24 3/4 scale. Not saying you can't doom or make sludgy hard rock on a Fender scale guitar or longer, but there is definitely some overtones, some harmonics, and more importantly to me, just the way I play the guitar that makes this scale length conducive for this kind of music. So I would recommend that. Obviously, it doesn't have to be the SG shape. It could be a Les Paul, Explorer, Flying V, whatever you like, but this is the guitar that I play this kind of material on most of the time. Second thing, passive pickups, PAFs at that. Patent applied for, of course. And I do think the vintage pickup, it doesn't have to be exactly PAFs or especially not the zebra stripe version, but some kind of vintage low to middle output kind of area does sound good for this material. But these pickups have some cool attributes in that when the tone is maxed out, they are a little bright and chewy, kind of too much so for some of the sleep material. But as you roll back the tone, it gets that mid-focused honky sound that I'm going for that works for all the droning material, though I end up keeping it on 8 to 10 generally for Mastodon stuff. And of course, there's some great volume roll-off interaction when you're using either the amplifier alone or particularly distortion pedals that clean up well when you roll the volume off. For tuning, it will be C standard for all the sleep stuff. It'll be D standard for Mastodon, and then there's like a drop B thing that sounds really cool on a couple of those songs. I think I'm using 52 gauge, 10 through 52s on this. You could definitely go heavier, whatever you like. Again, it's going to be more down to feel than tone in this particular area, I think. Starting off with Sleep then, and our stoner lord and savior, Mr. Matt Pike. The only time I've had the privilege of seeing him live was with High on Fire, where he uses Soldano amps, so it doesn't really cop the same sound. But for Sleep, he particularly likes the orange amplifiers live, especially recently. And all of the recent rig rundowns I've seen, this kind of uses whatever amps and all of the amps. Too many amplifier heads. There's the Rock Verb, there's the Dual Dark, which is, the bigger brother of this amplifier, which I think makes this a really good candidate for this video. I think he still likes some of the classic reissues of the OR120, so it's kind of hard to say, use this one amp to sound like the live version of Sleep. Looking into their back catalog only complicates things because during the Holy Mountain era, Matt was mostly using Laney amplifiers. I think it was the AOR series. Then for Dope Smoker, they moved on to green Matt amps, which are essentially the same circuits as the orange stuff, and feel free to look into all the orange and Matt amp rivalries yourself. But then, as the band took hiatuses and reformed, orange was kind of the staple sound. So it's kind of hard to say, go buy this one particular amp if you want to sound like Sleep, because there's a lot of amplifiers. And in fact, I think the Sciences, the most recent album, used a mixture of a modified Laney and some orange stuff and that sort of thing. But I think the Dark Terror does a really fine job of getting all of those sounds. The common element between all of my Sleep tone approximations comes down to the speaker cab, speaker model, and microphone selection I made, as well as the mic placement. So on stage, Matt Pike prefers the 4x12s loaded with K100s from Orange, which is quite a bit of headroom in terms of wattage when you're talking 400 watts versus even a 120 watt amplifier. For me, I chose my matching Randall RG100 4x12 loaded with 65 watt creambacks. And by the time you look at kind of the power differential between the amp head and that speaker cab, it kind of makes sense. And for me, though it's not the same construction, and there's way more high-end fizzle, and I feel like low-end on a lot of K100 cabs, it kind of works in the room given the EQ profile of this amplifier, and especially when you mic up the cabinet on the bottom row speakers, which is something I normally wouldn't do for these kind of videos, and especially when you're using a single dynamic microphone a good 6 to 8 inches away from the speaker cone. Now, this introduces a few interesting potential problems for me that came out quite well, though. First of all, I rarely like the sound of a single SM57 because of all the proximity effect and fizz issues you can run into. It's overdone in rock and metal to me, but it just works for this kind of stoner, doomy metal, especially when you back off of the cone itself, because you start to introduce more room sound. It sounds further away. It sounds, in some instances, fuller, maybe not as hi-fi, but that's what we're going for a lot of these stoner kind of sounds. And it is sensitive in where you actually point the microphone, because you start to get a lot more differential between the cone and the dust cap, and even a couple degrees will make all the difference in terms of the overall EQ profile. Normally, I wouldn't care for that, but given this amplifier has a single tone control, I kind of ended up using this as a tone control. So you'll see there won't be a lot of visual difference in the cutaways where I show you where I put the microphone, but play with this a lot because it will very much determine the recorded guitar sound you get. As far as pedals go, Matt is a bit of a, shall we say, pedal maniac. Unfortunately, the most recent boards that we can reference in his rig rundowns were stolen, which absolutely sucks. But there are a number of common elements between the kind of stuff that he'd use over the years. I'm going for the dry rhythm tones here, but if you want to add in some effects that he might use, something like my Zakk Wylde phaser pedal up there would sound great. Any of the MXR stuff, carbon copy delays, whatever distortion pedals you like. He's got some weird ring modulator stuff, and he routes them to different amplifiers. So kind of hard to go after matching his pedal board. But for the album tones, what I really found helped for the Holy Mountain sound was to use the venerable old GE7 by Boss, stick this up front, and dial in the frequencies to make this sound more like the evolved plexi tones of the Laney amplifiers. If you turn it off, it sounds fine. But for the Holy Mountain tones, I kept the amp right under noon to not overly saturate the power tubes, but keep it fairly loud. The shape knob over here close to 3 o'clock for a healthy scoop, but still sounding vintage relative to how far it scoops out when you completely max that thing. And then gain I only had here at about 1 o'clock because I was using the GE7 as a bit of a boost. So this is kind of a weird EQ curve. I don't know if you can kind of see that I've got 6.4K, 3.2K, and 800 higher in comparison to the rest of the sliders, which kind of in and of themselves form a bit of a smiley face. But I feel like this helps counteract some of the natural, shall we say, tube screamer hump kind of qualities that the gain stages have on this amplifier and give it a more plexy vibe for the Holy Mountain album. For the Dope Smoker tones, I really liked the rat pedal in front of this. And for all of the distortion stuff we're talking about today, but especially for sleep, you know, I think a lot of people are going to have this hang up of like, I got to have an orange amp or a orange style amplifier, and I got to have whatever specific pedal Matt is using now. And that's just not the case, because you can take a run-of-the-mill hard clipping pedal of your choice and find the one that works for you, put an EQ either before and after it, and you can probably dial in exactly what you want, because there's only so many ways to do hard clipping and only so many ways to do soft clipping. So for me, a plain Jane Rat 2 reissue sounded awesome with this, and I dialed in the distortion about 9, 10 o'clock, which is way higher than it normally would. Filter was about 9 o'clock, and then volume was just under unity because I wanted the fuzzy nature of that rat pedal to come through. Now, I don't believe he was using a rat pedal on that album, but when you combine it with this amplifier, it has that lo-fi green mad amp thing that I was exactly looking for. For Dope Smoker, I keep the gain knob about where you see it here, but the shape is rolled all the way back to where the tone stack is almost basically doing nothing. It's a big mid hump, and it sounds really great for that. And, you know, you can't drone on a single C chord without just cranking this thing. And I could have gone louder, quite frankly, but at about 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock is where I had the master volume, and that's where I felt like the rat pedal started really playing nicely with the tube saturation here. And then finally, for the more recent stuff, for the sciences, this is where I felt like the overall gain structure of this amp just worked. You can definitely use pedals in front if you'd like, but that's where I just started dialing in stuff to taste, push the gain a little bit higher, and it just worked right out of the box, no pedal necessary. Mastodon's tones are a bit of a different beast, which is funny we're talking about them considering Mastodon started after seeing a High on Fire show, and Matt is in both High on Fire and Sleep, so it all kinds of comes back around. But Mastodon has evolved far more as a band in terms of their sound and their songwriting, so their tones have evolved with them. And as such, it's kind of hard to use a single amplifier and cover everything from Leviathan and Remission all the way up to Emperor's Sand, and especially whatever they're working on now. But I think between the earlier material, which is my favorite, up through the masterpiece that is Oblivion, this can very much cop those kind of tones. Of course, nowadays, both Brent and Bill have their own signatures. You know, Bill's using the butter slacks from Friedman. Bill's using like a diesel VH4. Some orange stuff still on stage. Last time I saw them, they were using orange cabinets, as well as, you know, whatever modded JMP or Plexi that he's blending everything together. But, you know, orange was a part of their live sound, and it can very much be useful in attaining a lot of their studio tones. A few differences right off the bat from the Sleep material. First of all, I end up running the master volume a lot quieter for the Mastodon stuff, not necessarily because I think it sounds better quieter, but because I wanted less interaction from the power tubes here. And I already am kind of using a mid-heavy vocal speaker, so it just wasn't as necessary. I found that the distortion coming from the preamp and the pedals I was using was adequate. I also end up running the shape knob a little higher on average, anywhere between like 1 and 3 o'clock. Kind of has more of the blended amp, and especially some of the Marshall qualities that you hear on some of their, well, I wouldn't say more recent, but more recent of the batch of albums that we're looking at today. Though the gain does stay, you know, in the usual sweet spot of the Orange Dark Terror. For the speaker cabinet choice, I've once again defaulted to my Mesa oversized 4x12 with 70-watt vintage 30s because it's the hard rock speaker. They prefer V30s in their orange 4x12s. I think they use that in studio, even with some of the Marshall cabs that they use. It's just kind of hard to go wrong with. Every time I play through this cabinet, whether it be with you know, some of the Marshall-inspired amps that I have, or this amplifier in particular, it's just like, well, that sounds like Mastodon. Time to rock some you know, some Blood Mountain riffs. For the microphone choice, though, I ended up using both my SM57 and my Neumann knockoff, the Cam Crystal, for the condenser microphone choice. Never in tandem, though I'm sure it would have sounded fine if I blended the two. This just kind of had that pushed, dare I say, less polished production quality that I really like about their earlier material, like Leviathan or Blood Mountain is what I ended up using for this. With my microphone amp clamp mounting system, came in handy to kind of dial in the amount of high end versus you know, lower end that I wanted for the angle. But for some of their more recent and, dare I say, more complex guitar tones, I end up gravitating towards the condenser sound, and especially one that is more mid-range focused, doesn't have quite as much scratchiness to it like the Dynamics do, and just helps separate a lot of the sounds that we're going for in this video anyway. For the pedal side of things, the more recent pedal board shots of their stuff that I've seen is very much Tube Screamer and you know, kind of your bread and butter pedal selection. I did end up using the Tube Screamer. I have the Sparkle Drive mod in its, you know, just baseline mode for the Divinations demo, but on their earlier stuff, I liked a selection of hard clipping pedals, which again, does not necessarily reflect what they were using, but if you listen to the isolated guitar tracks on, you know, like Leviathan and Blood Mountain, they kind of sound nasty, and quite frankly, nastier than I remember even. But once you really dive down into it, there's almost a fuzzy blocking distortion kind of quality to it. And for that, I really liked both the Rat and the OD250 clone I have, which I believe I ended up setting to the Germanium mode, which kind of matches the MXR Distortion Plus. Again, kind of riding the drive and distortion controls higher than I normally would, backing off on the volume and letting the pedals do their thing. And that just has this, you know, amp that's about to explode quality that you can't really get out of the Dark Terror. You can definitely get a ton of saturation, but it's always kind of refined, and that's not what I wanted for here. I wanted to sound like I was about to make the console explode that, you know, all this signal was feeding towards. So I really liked both of those pedals. Again, pick your poison. If you've got a hard clipping or even a soft clipping pedal that does it for you, go for it. But I feel like in that especially era of Mastodon, they were just kind of going with whatever tone worked, and it's kind of hard to pick down one particular one for every album. I sort of glossed over the last third of that introductory demo, but I bet a lot of you still have questions about it, and hopefully this part of the video answers those. So for artists like Stephen Carpenter from Deftones, or Lure Lalonde from Primus, or seemingly all Polyphia, they basically use this as a glorified on-stage monitor rig, which is kind of a cool idea considering all these artists use orange cabs on stage. So if you've already got, you know, black 2x12s or 4x12s, it looks kind of neat to have these little lunchbox on top and drive those. And they do the classic thing that a lot of amp modeler users do, in that they have a direct sound going to front of house from their Axe FX2s, in the case of Polyphia and Deftones, and then they run a separate line with no cabinet emulation to the effects return of this amplifier, and that drives a cabinet. So you get a fully processed sound, in this case, full process preamp, power amp, you know, multi-effects, and then you get to hear it on stage. So the guys in the front row, guys or gals or whatever, don't get screwed out of the guitar sound if they can't hear the front of house speakers, and the guys on stage get to hear a little bit of the raw guitar sound. It's a good idea. Now, this is kind of an unorthodox setup, not necessarily a bad one. If it sounds good, it is good, but it's not really using this amp to its full potential, and it actually has some problems that would make me recommend against it. Now, it does look cool if you're using a bunch of black orange cabinets on stage, but for amp modelers, you know, if you run a solid signal, a completely processed signal to front of house, and then you split off before the cab IR and want to monitor on stage or have a stage sound that way, most people, myself included, would recommend a product like, say, the Seymour Duncan Power Stage or the Matrix Power Amp, something that is solid state, completely neutral, and lets the tone of the amp modeler do all the talking. Because tube amplifiers, as a lot of you might know, already have some tonal qualities to them that you don't necessarily want to stack with amp modeling software. It can sound good, and it might work just fine for you, but all of those power amp qualities are already being modeled here, so you don't necessarily want to stack a tube power amp model with an actual tube power amp. Again, if it sounds good, it sounds good. For my tastes, I did end up finding that a lot of the live sounds that I got out of this power amp and speaker cab combo to be a little too scooped, since there's probably already some speaker impedance interaction going on in this power amp. The negative feedback is definitely higher in this amp than some others, but using the V30 side of my 2x12 Jet City cabinet, some of them sounded really great, but some of them just sounded like they would get buried in a band context. So to me, I think you'd have to do some extra post-processing on the line out going to that to kind of counteract that effect. But with that said, there was still something to be said for the real speaker sound that does add some detail, I feel like, compared to some of the cab IRs that I use. So again, your mileage will inevitably vary, but for this kind of setup, you can revisit some of my old AX8 tutorials or what have you, and you will see that, for using an amp modeler, I always, at least almost always, recommend that you use a solid state power amp because that's kind of what it's designed for. Primus's Lure Lalonde does something similar. The last rig setup I saw of his, he was still using other orange amplifiers, but then I think there was some slaving and line level shenanigans going on that would eventually route into different half stacks of orange dark terrors on stage. So a little bit more complicated there, but kind of the same overall philosophy. You'd see he's not using the input, they're just using the straight power section. Now, one of the other reasons I would recommend against this is because there's no master volume or output level on the power amp itself. This is pre-effects loop, which means you basically have to control the volume entirely from whatever signal you're feeding it, which was a mistake for me because I had the effects loop cranked and hit play, and oh boy, she was loud. So be wary of that, and this is yet another reason I would recommend a different solution. But I guess this is all to say, even if you don't have a solid state power amp that's meant for amp modeling and you want to try the in-the-room cab sound with your amp modeler, you very well can. I would just recommend you turn off the power amp modeling on something like this or use the Line 6 preamp, blah, 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 and then run into the effects return. So hopefully that will clear things up as you see this demonstration carry. So that finally does it for this long postponed episode of Tone Engineer. Please tune back in another, I don't know, couple months, we'll see, for the probably final deep dive on this Orange Dark Terror head before it goes off to someone else who can get some more use out of it. I've had a lot of fun with it, and look forward to one last hurrah with it. I would normally ask in this section for feedback or your guys' opinions on what artists and tones I should cover, but I think I have too many to go through as is, so let's hold off on those for at least a few more videos, and then I'll gladly be all ears. Till next time, thank you so very much for watching, and we'll see you then. Bye.